On New Year's Eve, President Donald Trump announced he's withdrawing National Guard troops from Chicago, Los Angeles, and Portland. The announcement came after months of legal battles between the administration and Democratic-led states over presidential authority to deploy military forces in American cities. This is a story about a constitutional question that doesn't have an easy answer. When can a president send the National Guard into states without a governor's consent? Here's how we got here. In June 2025, protests broke out across the country in response to federal immigration enforcement operations. Some turned violent. In Los Angeles, the Trump administration responded by federalizing California's National Guard, taking command away from Governor Gavin Newsom and deploying 4,000 troops along with 700 Marines. Normally, state governors control their own National Guard, but federal law allows the president to take over under specific circumstances, including when there's a rebellion or when the president cannot execute federal laws with regular forces. The administration argued that ongoing protests at immigration facilities were preventing federal agents from doing their jobs. They cited violence against ICE officers and what they described as an inability to safely conduct immigration enforcement operations. Governor Newsom and California Attorney General Rob Bonta disagreed. They sued, arguing the deployment violated the Posse Comitatus Act, which prohibits the military from engaging in civilian law enforcement. Over the following months, similar deployments were announced for Portland and Chicago, and in each case, local and state officials challenged them in court. The legal battles produced mixed results at different levels of the judiciary. In California, a federal district judge ruled in September that the deployment violated the Posse Comitatus Act. He found that the protests did not rise to the level of rebellion required by law. However, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals paused that ruling and allowed troops to remain while the case continued. The appeals court suggested the unrest might have been significant enough to impede federal operations. In Portland, a federal judge permanently blocked the deployment in November, writing that keeping the military out of civilian law enforcement is foundational to the safeguarding of our fundamental liberties. In Illinois, both the district court and a unanimous three-judge appeals panel blocked the deployment. The appeals court found that the protests, even when occasionally violent, didn't meet the legal threshold for military intervention. The Supreme Court weighed in on December 23rd. In what appears to be a 6-3 decision, the court refused to allow the administration to deploy National Guard troops in the Chicago area. The majority wrote that the government failed to identify a source of authority that would allow the military to execute the laws in Illinois, and that presidential authority to federalize the National Guard likely only applies in exceptional circumstances. This was one of the few emergency appeals where the court ruled against the administration. A week later, Trump announced the withdrawals on Truth Social. He wrote that the cities were gone if it weren't for the federal government stepping in, and that crime had been greatly reduced by the deployments. He added that federal forces would return, perhaps in a much different and stronger form, when crime begins to soar again. Democratic governors responded by saying the court rulings forced the withdrawals. Governor Newsom said, "About time Trump admitted defeat." Governor Pritzker said Trump lost in court when Illinois stood up against his attempt to militarize American cities. The administration and local officials also disagree about the crime data. The Trump administration has pointed to reduced crime in cities where troops were deployed as evidence the strategy worked. The Department of Homeland Security released statements crediting federal operations with improving safety. Local officials tell a different story. Chicago released data showing 2025 had the fewest homicides since 1965. Violent crime was down over 20%. But city officials note that these declines began before federal operations started in September and continued a trend that was already underway. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson credited local police, community violence intervention programs, and investments in youth employment. He pointed out that in the districts where federal agents were most active, crime reductions were actually smaller than the citywide average. The independent analysts have weighed in as well. The University of Chicago Crime Lab found that violent crime declined in Chicago and many other major cities throughout 2025. Their conclusion: multiple factors appeared to be at play, and it's difficult to attribute the decline to any single cause. The Council on Criminal Justice found that Chicago's homicide decline in the first half of 2025 was about double the national average. They noted the drop was a part of a broader trend affecting cities across the country. It's worth noting where deployments continue. Over 2,000 National Guard members remain in Washington, D.C., where the president has direct authority over the D.C. National Guard. A federal appeals court paused a lower court ruling that would have ended that deployment, allowing it to continue while litigation proceeds. Troops also remain in Memphis, where Tennessee's Republican governor welcomed federal assistance. The legal questions raised by these deployments aren't fully resolved. The court rulings so far have been preliminary, focused on whether to allow deployments while cases proceed. The underlying constitutional questions about presidential authority over state National Guard troops in domestic situations will likely continue working through the courts. The administration has maintained throughout that the president has broad authority to protect federal personnel and property, and that judges shouldn't second-guess those decisions. Attorneys for the states have argued that every court to consider the question has found limits on that authority. There's also the question of what comes next. Some legal observers note that the president could potentially invoke the Insurrection Act, which provides broader authority for domestic military deployment. That hasn't happened, but the possibility has been discussed. For now, troops are leaving Chicago, Los Angeles, and Portland. The administration says crime will rise without them. Local officials say the deployments were unnecessary and potentially counterproductive. The courts have drawn some lines around presidential power, though exactly where those lines fall remains the subject of ongoing litigation. What do you think? Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video.